I hope you're all well. It's lovely to see you all here. This is the first of this year's tgiFHIs. I'm Ranji Khanna. I'm the director of the Institute. It's really, I'm really happy to welcome you here. We have 5 tgiFHIs this semester, and I believe 7 next semester. So, look out for the newsletter. If you're not signed up for the newsletter, sign up. So you get the information from us about what's going on, and we'll be, it's always, we say this, but somehow it never seems to happen exactly this way. Breakfast is served from 9 o'clock, and then we start at 9:30 with the talk. So I just want to welcome you. The series is a series that we've had going for 6 years now, and it is one where we invite a faculty member to come and give a talk on whatever they would like to talk about. There isn't a theme over the tgiFHIs, and this year I've invited some people to introduce our speakers, and today I'm really pleased that tgiFHI, my colleague in the English department, and also with affiliations in African American studies and maybe music. No, not right. Just a big buddy of the music department. Will be introducing our speaker, Khwezi. Okay.
Hey, so good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all. We're clearly among friends and fellow travelers. So it is a delight to introduce to you Khwezi Mkhize, who is an assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at Duke and the co-director of the Franklin Humanities Institute's Black Archival Imagination Lab. Prior to joining Duke, he taught at the University of Cape Town and the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. In addition, he has had a number of fancy fellowships, including at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities in Edinburgh. And 2 things that were part of the journey that's bringing him to the talk today that I think demonstrate one of the special things about Khwezi, which is that he works collaboratively with the same kind of energy as in his own individual work. So one of those was the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences working group that had the theme of Black archives and intellectual histories. And then at Stellenbosch, a working group residency as well. And then, of course, here he's leading the lab. What's also cool is the ways that his publication record now is, again, a combination of the collaborative and the individual. He has already 15 articles and book chapters. So when he has to choose his top 10 publications for a tenure file, and he'll have some tough choices to make, but he's also co-edited 2 collections of essays. One is already out. That was the first collection is called Foundational African Writers, Peter Abrams, Noni Jabavu, Sibisiso Nyembezi, and Eskia Mphahlele, which he co-edited with Makosazana Kaba and with Bekizizwe Peterson, who passed away tragically during that process and was a beloved teacher and intellectual for many of us in the Africanist community. And so one of the things I really appreciate about Khwezi is the way that he cultivated and has cultivated relationships with his teachers. He and I arrived at Penn and left Penn at exactly the same time. And I was privileged to be on his dissertation committee. And it's also very exciting to see how conversations that began a long time ago, We're not going to out our age. I'm using hair dye as well not to do that. But have evolved, and how some of the personalities and characters that he was thinking about then are really so rich as personas, as intellectual figures, etc. So in his talk today, he's giving us a piece of a book in progress called A Homemade Empire, South Africa and the Imperium. And I think one of the counterintuitive dimensions of that work is to think about empire not as something only to be resisted, but also as a framework in which connections and grounds for forms of resisting empire were forged. But the chapter we're going to hear from is Pan-Africanist Cape Town. And I think what he's going to do for us is really to show how the fin du siècle, which is, I think, the full part of that title, was such a pivot point for Pan-Africanism. There are a number of scholars who've paid attention to the Caribbean's involvement in this in an earlier period. So many of you probably know of Edmund Wilmot Blyden in particular, who our own late Valentin Mudimbe, who's actually being memorialized today, was one of the first people to write about. But of course, Paul Gilroy does as well. But really, that story kind of drops out of the West Indian connection. And what I think this paper will show is that, well, partially that connection, it really doesn't drop out because, of course, it was the Trinidadian H. Sylvester Williams who organized the Pan-African Conference of 1900. But it's circulating figures like the individual that he will tell you more about, F.C. Peregrino, who enabled Pan-Africanism to move from an idea to networks of relationships, etc. I could go on about it, but I think that's enough contextualization for now. And I'm looking forward to both the talk and a really animated conversation afterwards. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Khwezi, for your work, and enjoy.
Hey, thank you, Tsitsi, for that very kind, generous introduction. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Just going to read. Thank you all for coming out this morning. I would like to extend my gratitude to the director of the Franklin Humanities Institute, Ranji, for inviting me to present and reflect on my work here at the tgiFHI. I'm grateful to Tsitsi for the introduction and guidance across many years of developing these ideas. And of course, Eli, Johnny, Michael, Jamal, Eric, and the rest of the staff here at the FHI are always appreciated for the daily work they put in to make this space alive and work as well as it does. The foregoing is an excerpt from a manuscript I am working on. A Homemade Empire, South Africa's Imperium before World War II, moves away from the dominant periodization of apartheid, focusing on the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not only to give a genealogical framing of the conditions of possibility of apartheid, but more importantly, a broadening of its geopolitical significance by reading it as an imperial as much as it was a national project. Transcolonial and transnational mobility have long been associated with the cultural and intellectual exchanges that fostered anti-colonialism in the 20th century. Focusing on the hinge between empire and nation, this work unsettles the interpretive certitudes by which apartheid has become the dominant conjuncture for reading South Africa, while opening up the broader political and intellectual contexts through which Black diasporic engagements become a legible framework for thinking through its history. Of course, this framework continues to both challenge and broaden the senses in which the Black Atlantic came to provide a vocabulary for outer national genealogies, unbinding histories that have often remained in the shadows of the singular national histories of apartheid and the nation. Black intellectual formations provide their own frameworks and imaginaries of world-making, projects that remained incomplete, yet resistant to the world-bending forces of contemporary imperialism. Homemade Empire focuses on South Africa not so much as a national project, but under the aegis of the Black diaspora as a gathering point through which articulations of Blackness and nationhood took multiple forms, often at odds, threaded through multilingual prisms and gendered desires. As a geopolitical space then, South Africa in a homemade empire exists in relation to the numerous geographies in the Black world that were theaters for the making of modern Blackness before decolonization. My reflections this morning turn to Cape Town at the turn of the 20th century in the wake of the Pan-African Conference of 1900 in London. The sight of a Black face is as much hated and despised on the dark continent, the ancestral home of the Negro, as in any other country. This sentence, like its more famous corollary, was written at the dawn of the century of the color line. Its author, Francis J. Peregrino, was at pains to dispel one prevailing myth, that the Black man in Africa was somehow free from the demon of race prejudice. If it appeared that Africa would remain fixed by its difference, Francis J. Peregrino assured his readers otherwise. The natives of the so-called Dark Continent were not spared the injuries of racism. In the caveat, as in any other country, you find the color line drawn in its local and global manifestations. These ruminations are contained in a short history of the native tribes of South Africa, published at the turn of the 20th century. Francis J. Peregrino had returned to England, where he was born, from Cape Town around the time of the Pan-African Conference. The discourses in a short history of the native tribes of South Africa were initially given as lectures in Cape Town, where Peregrino had labored as the principal of the Progressive Institute for, quote, the amelioration of the condition of our people, end quote. It gave an insight into the manners and customs of the native Africans. The book's preface, though, went beyond the conventions of ethnographic descriptions and ventured to, quote, preface Blackness, end quote, for its readers. Brent Hayes Edwards has pointed out that writing that is located in paratextual thresholds, such as prefaces, demands that one keep an eye on, quote, signifying content, end quote, through which its, quote, framing gestures, end quote, link one context to another. These thresholds, as Edwards suggests, are the textual vectors that do the work of, quote, framing race, end quote, and links its epistemologies to internationalist perspectives. A short history of the native tribes of South Africa is clearly discursively aligned with the Pan-African Conference, but written from South Africa's oldest modern city, it arrived at an ephemeral end in London. A short history of the native tribes of South Africa came too early or too late. Described as, quote, a very slight volume, the contents derivative and of little value, end quote, its obscurity is bound up with that of its author and the brief history of encounters and almost encounters that I want to begin with. Given his preoccupation with presenting the condition of his brethren in South Africa to a metropolitan and diasporic Black audience, Francis J. Peregrino's absence in the Pan-African Conference is indeed peculiar. It owed perhaps to that a month before the Pan-African Conference commenced its work, he was arrested. His father, F.Z.S. Peregrino, who had traveled to London from Albany, New York, had heard the disappointing news through the press, attended the conference. In October of 1900, the elder Peregrino set sail for Cape Town with his wife and two younger children. By then, 3 generations of the Peregrinos had set, quote, revert sail, end quote, from Brazil to Africa, initially as manumitted slaves, settling in Accra, Ghana, and then again dispersing. F.Z.S. Peregrino would later travel to England for his education, and then the United States to begin his career as a labor broker and newspaperman before arriving in Cape Town, South Africa. After his unfortunate sojourn in England, Francis J. Peregrino was reportedly in the United States in 1901, where he seems to have remained during the First World War and through the 1920s. Bahia, Accra, London, Chicago, New York, Cape Town. More remarkable than their brief and rather unhappy stint in London was the Peregrinos' restless itineraries across the Black Atlantic. Their complicated relationship to the Pan-African Conference seems moot when read against their astounding migratory biography. As J. Lauren Mettery's work on Afro-Brazilians in the 19th century Black Atlantic shows, the Peregrinos arrived in London and Cape Town, having inherited a complex history of, quote, two-way commerce, end quote, that had, quote, transformative effects on both Brazil and West Africa, end quote. However, aside from exploring the Peregrinos as, quote, vehicles of transatlantic Yoruba identity, end quote, I want to focus on an aspect of 19th century Afro-Brazilian identity that Materi describes alongside this, their Englishness, particularly for FZS Peregrino, their Englishness, which, I beg your pardon, particularly for FZS Peregrino, led to the quest for a Pan-African community in Cape Town. The Peregrinos were connected to the global project of what Michael Hanchard has called Afro-modernity, but arriving from Afro-modern port cities such as Lagos and Accra, their status in the purveyance of modernity was increasingly displaced from the 1880s as racial discriminated handed Europeans positions they had hitherto occupied. The transatlantic history of Afro-Brazilians wrestles with the multifaceted cultures of modernity, questioning Europe's sole claims to its cultures and profusion. And even here, it remains to be asked what sense we are to make of the genealogies of the Pan-African movement when some of its most colorful figures missed each other in the shadows of the Pan-African Conference, but retraced each other's paths across the British Empire, surfacing in turn in Cape Town, Chicago, and New York, as FZS and Francis J. Peregrino did. Since FZS Peregrino's move to Cape Town amplified the reach of the African Association, which organized the Pan-African Conference across the provinces of South Africa and the then colony of Rhodesia, it expanded the geopolitical reach of Pan-Africanism in ways that generated concatenated geographies of collaboration haunted by their ephemerality. In a comment that effectively tied London and Cape Town and its Pan-African presence together, Dongela Masilela notes that, quote, Pan-Africanism was brought to South Africa, end quote, by FZS Peregrino, end quote, disseminated in the pages of his Cape Town newspaper, the South African Spectator, end quote. Edwards' important work has drawn our attention to how metropolitan France was one of the, quote, key places where African Americans, Antillians, and Africans were able to link up, end quote. It also opens up the space to consider these exchanges outside of metropolitan cities in Europe and America, in particular in how Edwards draws our attention to, quote, cosmopolitan ports as sites of new mixes for the institutions and forms of labor and communities of color organized by high colonialism that have deeper roots in the institution of capitalism and slavery, end quote. I find connections between Europe, America, and lesser discussed port cities such as Cape Town. If County Cullen famously posed the question, what is Africa to me, in his poem Heritage, here I somewhat rearrange its discursive geography by inserting Cape Town into the signifying economy of early 20th century Black diasporic engagements by asking, what was Cape Town to the culture of Pan-Africanism? In turning to Cape Town, I enact a response to one of the major calls raised by W.B. Du Bois, Alexander Walker, Henry Box Brown, and Henry Sylvester Williams in their address to the nations of the world that summarize the Pan-African Conference's aspirations for a world devoid of the sanctions of the color line. Quote, let not the natives of Africa be sacrificed to the greed of gold. This refrain, juxtaposed with others that map the geographies of race in the modern world, drew out what is at stake here and there for the inhabitants of, quote, the Black world, end quote, and, quote, the brown and yellow myriads elsewhere, end quote. The African Association was established in 1897. Henry Sylvester Williams, the convener and general secretary of the Pan-African Conference, was its secretary. On the 22nd of October, 1897, the Friend published a letter on the African Association's formation by the South African activist Alice Kenlock. In her letter, Kinloch sought to alert her readers in England that, quote, I have formed a society for the benefit of our people in Africa by helping them to bring some of the dark side of the things in Africa and elsewhere into light. I'm trying to educate people in this country with regards to the iniquitous laws made for Blacks in South Africa, end quote. These were the past laws and those around the mining compound system that channeled Black workers toward the crowded mines and managed their cheap labor and relationship to capitalism's spatial economy. The report of the Pan-African Conference frames Kinloch's activism in England as a major catalyst for its formation and work. Quote, Mrs. A.V. Kinloch, a native lady, end quote, it stated, had publicized the effects of, quote, the compound system in vogue in the mining district of South Africa, end quote. An issue that she made Williams aware of in her readings with the Writers Club. Though Kinloch was treasurer of the African Association, by the time of the Pan-African Conference, she had moved back to South Africa with her husband, Edwin Kinloch, and did not have the funds to travel back to London in time for the conference. Weirdly enough, it was the latter who was listed as vice president of the African Association's branch in the colony of Natal, South Africa. Again, against a pagey and haphazard archive, there's a growing body of work on Kinloch's seminal role in early 20th century Pan-Africanism in the Anglophone world. More detail of her life and work will enrich our understanding of, quote, how women articulated feminism and charted alternative trajectories and visions of Black internationalism instantiated in arts as well as activism, end quote, in the early 20th century. If Kinloch was absent for the Pan-African Conference, in the plea, quote, let not the natives of Africa be sacrificed to the greed of gold, end quote, can be heard echoes of her prior link up with Williams and their desire for, quote, vanguardist collaboration, end quote. Williams certainly felt that, quote, the association is the result of Mrs. Kinloch's work in England and the feeling that as British subjects, we ought to be heard in our own affairs, end quote. The brief encounters, misconnections, and archival disappearances that populate the Pan-African Conference haunt its historical traces and the genealogies of Pan-Africanism. What do we do with figures such as Francis J. Peregrino and Alice Kinloch, whose relationship to the Pan-African Conference seems not to be simply defined by the absence of it, as much as how their labors either enabled or supplemented it? In other words, prior to debating the ephemerality of the conference in the annals of Pan-Africanism, how do we fold the shadows back into the tinted contours of the conference and its beleaguered futures? When, in his famous article, Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanism, George Shepperson named Pan-Africanism with a capital letter as, quote, a clearly recognizable moment, end quote, he had in mind, quote, the 5 Pan-African Congresses, end quote. The omission of the 1900 Pan-African Conference, for which Du Bois attended and served as the chairman for the committee on the address, seems to anticipate his rise to preeminence in the interwar years, since in Shepperson's note, quote, the students of the role of chance in history would find it interesting to speculate on what Pan-Africanism would have become without Du Bois's longevity, end quote. Shepperson was, of course, not aware of the complexities and fluidity of the uses of his genealogical designations. He saw the 1900 Pan-African Conference as, quote, of significance for the emergence of the major formative conferences of modern Pan-Africanism, end quote, among other conferences held in Europe and America leading up to the close of the 19th century. It is Edwards's reading of what is generative about Shepperson's piece that provides the kernel for my geographic maneuvers here. In the uses of diaspora, Edwards sees Shepperson redrawing Pan-Africanism's discursive and genealogical uses as making room for, quote, ideological difference and disjuncture in considering Black cultural politics in an international sphere, end quote. An extension of this version is that, quote, a revised or expanded notion of Black international work would be able to account for such unavoidable dynamics of difference rather than issuing a universally applicable definition of Pan-Africanism or presupposing its exceptionalist version of New African New World Pan-African activity, end quote. It is here I would like to return to the Pan-African Conference and its imagined geographies. The report on the Pan-African Conference on the work of the Pan-African Association, the new name for the African Association, planned to, quote, hold similar conferences every 2 years, the next to meet in the United States in 1902, and subsequently in Haiti in 1904, other places to be decided in the future, end quote. In its projection of its futures, the Pan-African Conference had invoked a different geopolitical map to that of the Pan-African Congresses, 1900 to 1945, which the world wars, decolonization, and the rise of African nation states, led by Kwame Nkrumah, rearticulated from Euro-America to Africa. It imagined convocations that seemed to move outside of Europe toward north and south of the hemispheric West and into other geographies that appeared, by the spirit of its work, necessarily undetermined. The futures of the Pan-African Association and conferences were haunted not only by the crisis of reproduction. Williams was soon confronted with the association's financial woes and threat of dissolution while at a tour of the West Indies in 1901 to publicize the association, but of the possibility and impossibility of a future outside of Europe. As the conference drew to a close, it had already sketched out a patchy list of officers and branches in the USA, Haiti, Ethiopia, Liberia, South Africa and Rhodesia, Sierra Leone, Lagos, the Gold Coast, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Canada. If the Pan-African Conference was a saga of diasporic encounters, its future possibilities lay in other geographies to which the association's member would disperse and forge new solidarities. A version of the spatial orientation of Pan-Africanism seems to have already been indicated and given a precise geographic ordering by Francis J. Peregrino in A History of the Native Tribes of South Africa. Quote, there is indeed a great deal of work to be done in Africa for the amelioration of the condition of our people. The field is large, the laborers are few. My earnest advice to every man who has interest in our race at heart and who possesses the advantage of education is take your talents to Africa and there endeavor to diffuse knowledge in a country and among people who need it and where it will be most appreciated, end quote. Francis J. Peregrino could have substituted Cape Town for Africa. The Progressive Institute was said to be, quote, an educational and cultural organization for the African community, end quote, in Cape Town. His presence in Cape Town was far from exceptional. Cape Town was a colonial city bustling with a portmanteau of Black cosmopolitans by the turn of the 20th century. In a comment that draws out transnational working class networks in the British Empire, the historian R.E. van der Roos has pointed out that by 1890, quote, there were a number of West Coast Negroes and Jamaicans, West Indians, who had been brought into the country in order to work as stevedores at the docks, end quote. Elsewhere, van der Roos mentions that FZS Peregrino had, quote, was looked upon as a guide, counselor, and leader of the West Indians. He was not only a recruiting officer for bringing more Jamaicans to the Cape, but he also looked after their interests there, end quote. The links between the Peregrinos and West Indians was not fortuitous since, quote, their British imperial linkages, end quote, placed the city in their routes of migration and labor. Alan Gregor Cobley makes two significant points about the West Indian presence in Cape Town and South Africa on its timing and the predominance of seafarers. Quote, by the end of the South African War, there was already an established Afro-Caribbean presence in South Africa. In large measure, the explanation for this seeming paradox lies in various informal and indirect means of migration, and above all, in the role of Black seafarers, end quote. FZS Peregrino began publishing the South African Spectator by the beginning of 1901. Dr. George Fortescue Jackson lived in King Williamstown, but seems to have been connected with fellow West Indians in Cape Town. Rawson Wooden from British Guiana followed the path from London to Cape Town, where he opened the the private preparatory school in 1902. Henry Sylvester Williams joined his community of West Indians when he left London for Cape Town in 1903 to commence his career as a barrister after being called to the bar. Aside from the prospects of a legal career, Williams was soon deeply involved in Black politics in Cape Town. The global ethno-racial, social, and political cosmopolitanism of Cape Town led to the formation of the African Political Organization, or the APO, in 1902. While the APO is largely known as, quote, the first substantive colored association, colored, very particular kind of designation in South Africa, end quote, with national connections in South Africa, this framing ignores its roots in the diasporic and Pan-African energies and communities that had converged in Cape Town. Indeed, FZS Peregrino was one of the founding members of the APO, and Williams was soon involved with it once he arrived in Cape Town. Victoria Collis-Buthelezi has suggested that our reading of Cape Town's diasporic milieu be rethought in light of, quote, the Anglophone Caribbean, end quote, and how its presence in Cape Town not only complicates, quote, roots discourse, but pushes the limits of the Caribbean region's cartography, end quote. While I don't invoke the history and library of Caribbean studies here, I share Collis-Buthelezi's imagining of what transnational regionalisms would look like when pushed outside of, quote, the limits of nationally overdetermined knowledge projects, end quote. At the turn of the 20th century, Cape Town was a colonial metropolis all of its own. It was, as John Tengo Jabavu called it, quote, that English metropolis, end quote. As with Jabavu, FZS Peregrino saw Cape Town as, quote, the metropolis of the premier colony of South Africa, end quote. The city had risen to one of the highest of importance, quote, in the world history by virtue of being the theater of important historical events, end quote. His sense of the importance of Cape Town lay in his expectation that the South African War between 1899 and 1902, as the colony's political and administrative center, would bring about an order of racially inclusive citizenship under British rule. The local and global events that pushed Cape Town in South Africa from the throes of the South African War and launched it into the interwar years carried profound changes in the Black political imagination. Not like London, Cape Town was, quote, a site of African diasporic formation, intellectual production, and political organizing, where the larger context of empire presented the generative ground for imaginings of a global Black community, end quote. These insights are summed up by the towering specter of mineral capitalism that spawned the rise of Johannesburg as, quote, the symbol par excellence of the African modern, end quote. If, as Achille Mbembe and Sarah Natal suggest, quote, the vertical and racial segmentation of Johannesburg, of the Johannesburg urban world was given structure and order by what it relegated beneath, mines, end quote, as marked by its racial regime of mineral capitalism, meaning, quote, as far as Johannesburg is concerned, more than the surface of the vertical city with its skyscrapers, the underground seems to hold the keys to unlocking the circuits of its modernity, end quote. The turn to the Black diaspora in Cape Town that I make here invokes spatial dialectics that cut across nation, colonial, imperial, and the diasporic, while remapping the Black diaspora's making of space and community. Cape Town supplied not only the grounds for the rise of white supremacy under the guise of liberalism stewarded by Cecil John Rhodes, but also longings for alternative forms of empire, racial kinship, and transnationalism. As an English metropolis, Cape Town resituates the cultures of Black transnationalism that Paul Gilroy ascribes to the Black Atlantic's countercultures and roots it through an African port city and its articulation of global Anglophone dreams of belonging and liberation. Okay, the next section is just a reading of sort of these processes in action, and then I'll conclude. On the 19th of February, 1901, Bishop Levy J. Coppin arrived in Cape Town. Coppin had been nominated as the General Conference of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 1900 to be bishop of its new 14th district, South Africa. His wife, Fanny Jackson Coppin, docked in the city on the 30th of November, 1902. The Coppins' arrival at the Cape kept an almost decade-long history of the AME's conversation with the Ethiopian Church, which in 1892 was formed after some Black members of the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society in Pretoria withdrew its membership and struck a separatist path. It's interesting that in the late 60s, Black consciousness movement is also sort of like withdrawing from like sort of white liberal sort of student organizations, but maybe we'll come back to that. A major catalyst for the Ethiopian Church joining the AME was Charlotte Maxege, then Manye, who, as a student at Wilberforce University in Ohio, had written a letter to her sister Kate Manye on a letterhead with the insignia of the AME Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, who actually was also in South Africa in the early 20th century. W.P. Du Bois, who had taught Maxege at Wilberforce in the 1890s, would later reflect on her role as, quote, a pioneer in one of the greatest human causes, working under extraordinarily difficult circumstances to lead a people in the face of prejudice, not only against her race, but against her sex, end quote. Turner would later visit South Africa. Kate Manye showed the letter to the Ethiopianist Reverend Mangena Mukone, who took an interest and wrote to Turner in May of 1895. The Ethiopian Church sent a delegation of Mukone along with James Dwane and Jacobus Xaba to seek affiliation with the AME Church. In 1896, the Ethiopian Church merged with the AME Church. In 1905, Levi J. Coppin published Observations of People and Things in South Africa, an extensive treatment of his time and labors to build religious and racial community for the AME in South Africa. When Fanny Jackson Coppin died in January of 1913, Levi J. Coppin performed his last duties of seeing her book, Reminiscences of School Life and Hints of Teaching, which she was urged to write by friends, published. Reminiscences of School Life included sections on her time in South Africa and the mission to bring about the modernization of its African peoples. Collins Buthelezi suggestively reads Reminiscences of School Life as, quote, a late slave narrative, end quote, one in which the emancipatory migrations of the African-American subject, quote, culminates at Cape Town, end quote. Born into slavery, Jackson Coppins' journey from bondage to freedom begins in the District of Columbia, where she's born. Her freedom is subsequently bought by her aunt, Sarah Orr Clark, who sends her to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where she would, quote, get a little education if I could, end quote. With some help from her aunt, she was, quote, able to pay my way to Oberlin, then the only college in the United States where colored students were permitted to study, end quote. Jackson Coppins' journey to freedom and self-making thus coincides with the narrative of education, a motif which expands from the process of individual becoming to the upliftment of racial community in Philadelphia under the shadow of the color line. Reminiscences of School Life is composed of 13 chapters. My visit to South Africa is the last chapter in the book, evidently concluding Jackson Coppins' biography and musings on her life and work. In this sense, to build on Collins Buthelezi's work, the structure of the narrative globalizes the journey from enslavement to freedom, as culminating in vistas of enlightenment, modernity, and racial community beyond America's borders. However, rather than placing the narrative of religious enlightenment in an African geography to which the prodigal African-American subject makes a heroic return, Cape Town signifies a terrain of coevality in which modernity is both familiar and the site of a spatialized relationship between the South African metropolis and its hinterland. The religio-diasporic world-making captured in Reminiscences of School Life reflects the mapping of what Jarvis McInnes calls the global Black South. Though McInnes reads, excuse me, US South and Caribbean relations through, quote, how the plantation emerges as a figural and literal organizing principle for tracing the global Black South, end quote, a history which Cape Town, because of its history of plantation modernity and British imperialism, is connected with, I am interested in how the project of Black modernity produces its own gendered mental and relational landscapes. Fanny Jackson Coppin was evidently fixated with Cape Town's modernity as framing her and Levi Jenkins Coppin's engagements with Southern Africa. After giving the customary salutation of Cape Town as, quote, in a sense, a modern city, end quote, she soon confronts the civilizational project's uneven spatial economies and shades of difference. Quote, we're often asked why we made our headquarters at Cape Town instead of going and remaining far away into the interior, doing work entirely among the uncivilized. But it was hard indeed for us to turn away entirely from the conditions that met us upon the very entrance into the country. It is true the bulk of our work was far away from Cape Town, among people in primitive life. But it was a good thing to have a base at this seaport town where occasionally we could return to modern life, where we could also work among those who needed us quite as much as those who had not been introduced into the blessedness of civilization that places the acquisition of wealth far above the redemption of souls, end quote. It is here the meaning of Cape Town that, quote, my special work, end quote, began, writes Jackson Coppin. It is from the AMC's Mission House, Bethel Institute, that Jackson Coppin's work with women flourishes, carving out new spaces for Black women's self-assertion and entry into modernity. Quote, women who never before had appeared in public for Christian work, at least never before to take a leading part in it, end quote. Cape Town figures as the geography of women's work in my visit to South Africa. However, Jackson Coppin's travel outside of Cape Town and its accompanying mission work is done through her husband, or as she puts it, through marriage. If travel, and indeed the travel narrative discursively masks the masculine predomination over the geography to be traversed, how does Southern Africa beyond Cape Town figure in Jackson Coppin's experience? As if measuring her alienation from the gendered region of domesticity that is Cape Town, in spatial terms, she observes in one passage, quote, in my travels over the work with my husband, I went as far as Bulawayo, 1,360 miles from Cape Town. The journey was long, tiresome, and trying. At the meeting held there in our mission house, I had a new and not pleasant experience, excuse me. For after endeavoring to forget the fatigue caused by the journeys, I made my accustomed address by the aid of the interpreter and was seized by a fainting spell. I had for years been accustomed to hard work and often depredation, but never before had fallen at my post, end quote. The race work that is folded into the narrative vignettes on travel between her adopted home and its elsewheres in Southern Africa's hinterland is marked by the strain that journey, its unfamiliar destinations and sociality place on Jackson Coppin. In this missionizing narrative of modernity, Cape Town marks both the extension of the narrative of racial uplift and a redoubling of the familiar landscape of difference to be converted, and yet whose resistance maintains a distance that ultimately Cape Town, or only Cape Town, can naturally bridge. But when read against Cape Town and Bethel Institute as troping home, does Jackson Coppin gender the spatial dialectic of Black missionizing? If Southern Africa's interior, with all of its narrative and cosmic trappings of the uncivilized world, resists and seemingly deranges her body beyond the return to Cape Town, how is the extension of Afro-Christian modernity imagined beyond its point and its subjective entropy? It is Jackson Coppin's narration of the diasporic modernity through marriage that it seems the incommensurabilities exacted by the unfamiliar are overcome. This perspective necessitates, in a way, an intertextual reading of my visit to South Africa alongside Coppen's observations of persons and things in South Africa. Fanny Jackson Coppen's privileging of Cape Town as a newfound site of race women's work contains some significant kernels for my reading of Levick J. Coppen's longer observations of persons and things in South Africa. Coppen, too, is concerned with the modern Black subject's mobility through Cape Town and Southern Africa. But where, for Fanny Jackson Coppen, travel simultaneously marks the necessary extension of modernity and the limits of Black women's agential capacities in it, observations of persons and things in South Africa narrates travel as a narrative organizing trope and space-making process, as, quote, unmarked by its historically gendered technologies, end quote. However, Cape Town is for both figured as a focal point for familiarized socialities and the narrative of African modernity. After describing the institutional history and politics of the AME Church that led to their travel to South Africa, Coppen projects Cape Town into the very narrative of modernity that the doxology of colonialism reads Africa as an anathema of. Travelers and writers have said so much about Cape Town that is about as well known to the average readers as most other important seaport cities. Still, many people in thinking about Africa, darkest Africa, do not always stop to consider that civilization has been in this portion of the continent for a long time, end quote. It is precisely Cape Town's coevality with colonial modernity that gives it its privileged and vocational status in Coppen's imagination. As an unnamed source by Coppen suggests, the city's modernity owes irrevocably to its seaside location, one that stands alongside that of others. Quote, the great charm of Cape Town, entitling it to the rank of Naples, Rio de Janeiro, and San Francisco as one of the most beautifully situated seaports in the world, is the magnificent mountain which rises behind the town in a sheer precipice to the height of 3,582 feet, cutting the skyline with a jagged horizontal front 2 miles in length, end quote. If Cape Town calls into question the narrative of darkest Africa, what are its modernity's conditions of possibility? For Levi J. Coppen, Cape Town's modernity is legible through its liminal spatiality as both literal and colonial, a history that he invokes by gesturing towards its long durée. Should I just not read or read the call? Read it. Okay. The history of the place dates back as far as 1846, and the actual occupation by the Portuguese as far back as 1503. From that time until now, it has been variously held by Portuguese, Dutch, and English. At first, it was but a trading post, but subsequently it grew into a permanent settlement. The Cape first called the Cape of Storms was afterwards called the Cape of Good Hope, which name it still bears. Table Bay, no longer a terror, became a coveted port of entrance for merchants en route to India. It is now as lively with craft of various nations as most modern seaports, and far more than many. Cape Town itself is a beautiful modern city nestling beneath the shadow of the famous Table Mountain, end quote. These descriptions would introduce us to Cape Town that Coppen docked in 1901, of course, subvert colonial inscriptions of Africa as a geography of difference. But observations of persons and things in South Africa is bedeviled by a fundamental problem in its inscriptions of scenes in South Africa outside of the colonial imagination. While the text resists totalizing discourses of racial difference, this is in a way to be expected since Fanny Jackson Coppen put it, writing about Africa involves in some ways a migratory and spiritual return home. It cannot entirely escape the discourse of otherness and the semantics of time that structure the expected and yet delayed leap toward modernity. One way to address the inevitable tensions between Levi J. Coppens' simultaneously claim of and search for modernity is to read observations of persons and things in South Africa as a travel narrative of sorts. I do not mean to suggest here that Coppens necessarily intended his book to function as a travel narrative per se. What interests me is how, in the negotiation of the tension between the transnational search for racial upliftment and the contradictory effects of colonial modernity, Coppens turns precisely to what Mary Louise Pratt calls the polyphony of genres that travel writing carries. In their normative position as texts mediating the colonial project, travel narratives were, quote, one of the key instruments that made people at home in Europe feel part of a planetary project, a key instrument in creating the domestic subject of empire, end quote. There's one feature of colonial travel writing that Pratt discusses and to which I want to pay some attention. As she points out, the description of the customs and manners of the native, quote, is a mainstay of travel and exploration writing. And under the rubric of ethnography, it has been professionalized into an academic discipline, which serves in part to mediate the shock of contact on the frontier, end quote. The penchant for ethnography in travel writing serves the ideological function of fixing the other and denying them coevality. Quote, in the case of travel writing, manners and customs descriptions is always in play with other sorts of representations that also bespeak difference and position subjects in their own eyes, end quote. In Imperial Eyes, Travel Writing and Transculturation, Pratt picks up on another dimension of the ethnographic imagination in the genre. Quote, if ethnographic texts are a means by which Europeans represent themselves, their usually subjugated others, she argues, autoethnographic texts are texts that others construct in response or in dialogue with those metropolitan representation. Autoethnography involves partly collaborating with and appropriating the idioms of the conqueror, end quote. Indeed, Levi J. Coppens' arrival in Cape Town, narrated in the third person as if it were the gift of providence, recalibrates the narrative of modernity through the figure of the Black diasporic subject. You're gonna have to rely on what I say, not what you say. Let's see. It'll be fine. The clouds began to disappear and all started to the work with renewed zeal and the determination upon the arrival of Bishop Coppens, February 19th, 1901, end quote. If colonial enlightenment is predicated on the other's access, as Achille Mbembe puts it, to time on the move, then in observations of persons and things in South Africa, it is equally a geographic modality. As Coppens claims, quote, civilization beginning at the Cape of Good Hope had proceeded as far in a northeasterly direction as far as Pretoria and northerly as far as Mafeking, end quote. This spatial dialectic of modernity plays out in a number of interconnected ways in observations of persons and things in South Africa. Firstly, Coppens, writing for an audience outside of South Africa, presumes a Black audience, is preoccupied with the culture and customs of native Africans. It is through, quote, our journey from Cape Town to Bulawayo, end quote, that he encounters, quote, the native at home, free, easy, and uninfluenced by modern civilization, end quote. The travel motif is thus inspired by the desire to see the difference between native life in civilization and outside of it. A difference, he writes, quote, that can only be appreciated when both sides are seen and the comparison made, end quote. Secondly, having established the journey motif as a structure of comparison, Coppens' reading of colonial modernity and its violent impositions of progress take on an increasingly ambivalent tone. In a moment of self-reflexive metacritique, one in which the ethos of autoethnography seems most alive, Coppens then turns the conceits of the colonial travel narrative on their head. Now we're getting it together. It is quite amusing to hear people who have visited Africa declare definitely that they know all about the country. Perhaps they have spent a month or a few months all told, perhaps a year, but what if they have spent 20 years? they have only seen here and there a tribe and only trod upon a small portion of land, which, if taken from the continent, would scarcely be missed. The few railroads which are now in operation in Africa may be compared to a wider web in an obscure corner of a large mansion. Most visitors to Africa have never been 50 miles from a railroad. It is the explorers, the Livingstons and the Stanley, who alone have a right to speak of their knowledge of Africa. And even theirs was limited. There are portions of Africa upon which civilized feet have never trod, and it may be yet centuries before we can speak of knowing Africa as Europe and America are known. If the travel narrative was popularized by, quote, the Livingstons and the Stanleys, if the travel narrative as popularized by the Livingstons and Stanleys, quote, encode and legitimate the aspirations of economic expansion and empire, end quote, the autoethnographic narrative turn in observations of persons and things in South Africa calls into question the discourse's totalizing claims to planetary knowledge. Yeah. Coppens's provincialization of the colonial mode of knowledge is bound by the trappings of familiarity and introduces a contingency to the travel motif that gives greater presence to the local inhabitants' consciousness, creating ground for a different ethics of encounter. Here, an alternative reading of the politics of the context zone is given through the voice of Coppens's interpreter, whose translation of the codes of modernity give rise to an ethical critique. Quote, I asked my interpreter as we passed by, kraal after kraal, what the people would do should we suddenly appear among them as strangers. The answer was, they would treat us kindly, give us something to eat, and nurse us should we become sick. But, he said, when they get a taste of our civilization, they may learn how to become robbers, end quote. Since the interpreter's ethical code derives precisely from an intimate knowledge of the customs of the tribe, his critique of modernity recuperates life worlds and their social and cosmic ties hitherto denigrated by colonialism and either distorted or overlooked by the colonial travel writer. Through this moment, Coppens rewrites the travel narrative's will to dominance by bringing into sharp relief the decadence of European civilization. Quote, gold and diamond seekers in their work of prospecting will go from place to place in the treasure-wielding portions, and when they find in the fields containing the coveted wealth will halt, plant a civilization that will extend a few miles around about, a civilization which, I'm sorry to say, is even more degrading to the native people than their ancient customs, end quote. There is, of course, the danger that Coppens could be idealizing the African past in order to erect his own position between tradition and modernity, in order to valorize the former's ethical, humanistic value. But since the colonial schema of difference was predicated on the notion of African history and culture as a void, it is important to keep in mind that, as Bhekizizwe Peterson put it, quote, in Black communities, the attempts to envision and elaborate alternative understanding of history were acts of knowledge production that negated imperial and colonial modernity, and especially their politics of racial subjection and exclusion, end quote. In other words, in the live contestation of the colonial imagination, the terrain of tradition, culture, and custom were not past, but the sources of evaluating the givens of colonial culture and its arresting narratives of progress. I'm almost done. The uses of the historical and ethnographic narrative by Coppens and others was thus motivated by the need to make space for Afro-modernity in the colonial matrix of white missionary claims to the right to govern African salvation, the colonial state's denial, and the colonial state's denial of African citizenship. Francis J. Peregrino's A Short History of the Native Tribes of South Africa, for instance, is not really a history. It too is interested in reinscriptions of the ethnographic imagination as a basis for resisting colonial abasements of the African past and subject, while making ground for diasporic Black modernity as a code for reanimating time. Coppens's reading of colonial capitalist progress as ironic and racially exclusive, as an ironic and racially exclusive enterprise is significant. Racial capitalism takes on increasingly ambivalent color. It's laid to claim as a harping of progress, both racially debilitating and haunting the very idea of colonial citizenship. Cape Town, as many would say then and now, is where it begins in South Africa. But it echoes and reflects London, Accra, Lagos, Johannesburg, Manchester, and many other nodes where networks of African solidarity sought to reimagine a world beyond the color line. How its entanglement with racial subjection has always been so is a story for another time. I will end with this. As Sila, the enslaved woman and narrator of Yvette Christianse's novel, Unconfessed Avers, quote, "We are the offspring of that Cape of Good Hope, and the Cape of Good Hope is the place that fathers one branch of what the minister's wife calls a family tree, while the other is mothered. And let me tell you, that place will make us who we are, but it will deny us." Thank you.
You take questions.
Yeah.
The floor is open.
Have to.
Questions. Well, I don't mind starting us off. If there isn't another one, bring this. I'm interested to understand how the politics of language doesn't play out and how it shifts over time. You know, you talked at various points about, you know, with the Caribbean context, the sort of the limit of the Anglophone Caribbean, and the way in which that becomes part of the, you know, I think it's sort of the limit itself that you were saying, it becomes part of the larger discourse around Pan-Africanism. So I'm curious to understand polyphony within the context of different languages as well, whether it's in terms of a sort of comparative colonial history and those languages, or whether we're talking about African languages, or what do we understand as an African language through this model of Pan-Africanism? Is English itself an African language, for example? I'm curious to just hear how we might understand that in the context of what you're saying and how it shifts. Thanks.
Question and answer, more question? Well, I think question and answer. Yeah, the section on Peregrinos's, older Peregrinos's newspaper, South African Spectator, sort of really brings him sort of right into these kinds of questions, right? Because immediately, you know, the conference happens, he starts the newspaper, and he's sort of immediately then confronted with the question of how do you then imagine this Pan-African nation in Cape Town, right? There's English, there's Afrikaans, the African languages, you know. So then translation becomes a really interesting question. And for me, on the one hand, while in the practice of diaspora, Brent Hayes Edwards is sort of moving between French and English. In colonial context, languages are hierarchicized, right? So people such as Sol Plaatje, who have this history of having worked as court interpreters, are often sort of confronted with the ways in which how Africans who do not speak English find themselves sort of caught up in the legal system, condemned over things that they don't even understand. So the very way in which language mediates and negates recognition is important. This is a way of thinking about Pan-Africanism, is then as a project of trying to bridge these differences through translation and languages, right? So that the newspapers themselves are multilingual, but in some ways they're also just fractured by the very sort of contingencies of the community that they're trying to bridge together, right? So there's always that sort of complicated sense of trying to sort of articulate something that is fragile or not. But also it's a fraught moment in South Africa, right? The colonial state is sort of morphing into what becomes the Union of South Africa in 1910. So then the question of citizenship, for me, one of the things that at stake is that then who belongs, right? Is it your colonial sort of identity in the Cape that is important? Or is it one's own sort of imperial identity as part of the sort of British Empire? But then who gets to speak for either the kind of colonially or the imperially inscribed project of citizenship? And that for me is one of the interesting kinds of complications of the imaginings of this kind of Pan-African community. Yeah.
Thank you, Khwezi, for such a enlightening talk, and also for this, just kind of following up on this question. I think one of the intriguing and valuable things that I would love to know more about, perhaps in this chapter, but really in the context of today, is how the Lusophone circuits actually do change our narrative of Pan-Africanism. And I'm remembering in this room, Atto Quaison talking about, growing up in Ghana and the returnees being a significant, the Brazilian returnees in Ghana being and Nigeria, a significant presence in the 19th century, right? So you have, and as you mentioned, those 3 generations of peregrinos coming from West Africa seem like an opportunity to think about that Pan-African transnational Black circulation. But that also would really change, I think, what happens to the Lisbon Conference in 1923 for that version of the Big P Pan-African Congresses, right? That often gets left out. And Sita Nunez, I think, is somebody at Penn now who's writing a bit about that. But I think again, this is maybe related to the language question. So on the one hand, what is possible telling a longer story of Pan-Africanism? But then also, what happens to Haiti, which kind of becomes this sort of floating abstract presence? There's somebody at the conference, right? I can't remember his name, representing, I think, Abyssinia, but from Haiti. But that presence kind of falls out of these other things. And I'm curious, is that simply because it wasn't an important site of oceanic trade in this moment? Or might that abstraction of a place tell us something about the value of the very concrete material territorial presence of South Africa of Cape Town, sorry, in this story? So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's really rich questions, a lots to think about, Cici. Yeah, I'll say 2 things, and both of which I'm thinking about. The one section that I'm sort of need to work quite a bit on is on Harry Dean, who claims to be a descendant of Paul Coffey. And his proposition in the Pan-African Conference, he's not taken seriously, is that if the project of sovereignty is one that is to be taken seriously, then we need a ship. That's his proposition, right? And he then buys a ship called the Pedro Gorinho. And the interesting thing is that he ends up in Cape Town, right? But ultimately, his own sort of attempt to sort of form this sort of space of Pan-African sovereignty, it's actually around where Mozambique is, right? So, that's one of the things that I find sort of interesting, this idea that, Michelle Stevens, when she writes about the Negro ship of state. So you can sort of see that just a generation before before Gavi, right? But how Cape Town and sort of Mozambique is sort of tied together. I mean, the quote from Unconfessed, Sila, the character, is an enslaved woman from Mozambique, right? So there's a way in which the idea of the history of enslavement and colored identity sort of sublimates all these different sort of migrations into this sort of like ossified category that in some ways fixes all of these other sort of migrations. What's at stake for me is something that Faith Smith is sort of thinking about in Strolling in the Ruins, because part of what she's sort of confronting in that book is the idea of, at least among Caribbean intellectuals, sort of this sort of first decades of the 20th century as sort of like these sort of quiet sort of decades, right, before the rise of the CLR Jameses and others. And one of the things that she's sort of trying to think about is precisely what's being worked out in these sort of quiet decades, right? And she's reading how figures in the Caribbean are reading newspapers and reading, for instance, about the Bambata Rebellion in Natal in South Africa, right? And in some ways, there's sort of cross sort of colonial trans-imperial sort of reading of geographies of resistance is allowing them to calibrate what's at stake about sort of how and whether you sort of take on sort of colonialism in these different ways or another. So that's one of the things that I'm actually really, really interested in seeing about, like, you know, if people in the Caribbean are sort of doing this work and reading these South African newspapers, reading about these political events in South Africa and West Africa, can one do the same in other ways? In which case, then where does Haiti sort of fit in that? I mean, that's an interesting sort of thing, right? That it is a history of this revolution, and it seems that this sort of political moment is one of recalibrating the stakes of certain kind of political actions, at least from what I'm getting from the book. So, yeah, it's more to think about.
Appreciate the work. I feel like this chapter alone gives me too many points of entry, but I did kind of want to try to make a bit more sense of, I guess, the project of modernity when it comes to both these nodes of Pan-African encounter, but then also within the narratives that you kind of brought out in the second half of your reading. Was modernity something that was directly like at stake within I guess what you call like the direct Pan-African spaces in Cape Town? Like, meaning you talk about it with the travelers who they speak of modernity, but it's not something they have to worry about. Is modernity something that was considered in like Pan-African debates as well? Or is that something that they had to like deal with alongside these traveler logs and the narratives that start to come forth?
Yeah, it's Cape Town, like then and now, does this sort of weird exceptionalizing thing discursively, right? Where in some ways modernity is always there, and it sets up this sort of like relationship between Cape Town and these other places, like, is Bulawayo not modern, right? But there's something about this space that you sort of travel to, like Johannesburg, not modern, so there's sort of something that I'm still thinking about discursively there, about what Cape Town is also doing and setting up. What I think is happening that I should actually just maybe try to write out more clearly is that because in the 19th century, through sort of the franchise in the Cape, Black people or Black men, they have the franchise and are sort of able to vote and not be represented. There's something about the assumptions about how citizenship can be sort of claimed from Cape Town that I think does lend sort of a different kind of like political sort of location, and it might explain why people end up there, right? And that sort of gets eroded leading up to the 1930s and apartheid. So there's the question of modernity, but for me, there's also then the question of citizenship, because there's something that is really at stake about what then the project of imperial liberalism as one that has these universalist claims with particular sort of racial exclusions is actually doing. So I think what's happening with these claims of modernity is that there's an attempt to actually lay claim on a process of citizenship. It's not quite clear here, but they're writing in the immediate aftermath of a civil war. So they're also trying to sort of locate, find a space for Blackness and citizenship as the racial state itself or the racial polity is working out these exclusions. Henry McNeill Turner gives evidences in the South African Native Affairs Commission. I think it was like in 1905, and I might want to look into that to see this. So how is he engaging with like the state's own evidences, right? Because the state at this point is literally trying to fix these categories, like, and they do these weird things like, what is a colored? A colored is a person who's not European or African, right? You know, but they're going to fix bodies into that, right? So, you know, I'm curious about interventions that are being made, but literally, the franchise that is established in the 19th century is at stake, right? So, yeah, Cape Town just stages a lot of things. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Khwezi. My question may not be very relevant, but I was expecting to hear a little bit about the Francophone Pan-Africanists. Do we have any difference, or your research did not go to that area? At least mention some of them, because when we talk about Africa, Francophone is quite big, and they were also Pan-Africanists.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yeah. So there are a couple of things that are happening. I mean, the Pan-African conference itself. I mean, Haiti is also part of as a delegate, you know, represented there. And I think because what I'm interested in is then what happens in the aftermath of the conference, and people who end up in Cape Town, you end up in this sort of like Anglophone sort of space, right? You know, but which isn't to say these connections cannot be made. I mean, someone like Eskiam Patlele, for instance, who leaves South Africa in the wake of apartheid, he ends up working for, is it the Congress for Cultural Freedom? You know, Gerard Sekoto ends up in Paris as a painter. People such as Ernest Mangoba, who was a part of Cobra as an artist. So there are all these connections. They happen at different historical moments. But I do think that there's something sort of like really specific about how the Cape sort of anchors a very particular kind of relationship to Britishness that is staging certain claims about citizenship, right? But then someone like Gary Wilder, who writes about the imperial nation state, is actually thinking about similar kinds of questions in relation to, the figures, the sort of founding figures within negritude, right? So you can actually make parallels between these kinds of projects via the framing, I think, of the imperial nation state, right? So I'm sort of seeing it from a slightly different perspective, but I think it's a lot of the same things at stake, you know. And the newspapers are interesting. I mean, I can't tell much about the presence of sort of French, but there is a global presence in the way these newspapers are able to cite each other across geography.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm interested if you could say a little bit more about this spatial dialectics of modernity, because I'm very interested in, again, the way by which the interaction between space and time, as you said, whether it's Durban, whether it's East London, or the Cape, and you're focusing on the Cape, how does this ethics of encounter differ depending on who is encountered? Again, as you're saying, if to the Peregrino, if there is, again, this Lusophonic refraction, or on the Cape, if it's also mediated through, again, Indian immigration. I'm very interested how modernity and time is this encounter is also being, again, mediated through a translator who, again, may or may not also be, again, informing and altering how this spatiality is moving from coastal inward.
Yeah, I don't think I'll get to it quite the way framing it, but yeah, you can clearly see that what I'm sort of wrestling with is this idea of like sort of Cape Town set up as this foundational modern space. So when you move out of Cape Town is where this sort of possibility of like missionizing and conversion, which is also, you find all these ideas about sort of uncivilized, etc. So there's something simultaneously kind of like temporal about this sort of like spatial project. And what I haven't resolved in my head that it seems, or at least the way I'm reading Fanny Jackson Coppins, is that this sort of move into this space is sort of like, sort of leads to sort of, she goes through this like fainting spell, right? It's also mediated by the presence of a husband who seems to sort of, is able to like mediate the space in other ways. So when his narrative takes over, so he's engaging with these other people and is able to sort of stage all these other resistances. So there's something about how this sort of coupling them as a couple, but also how space itself is sort of like gendered. So for me, it's also, is there something happening about how this masculine figure is the one that's able to sort of mediate this relationship between the self and other? Whereas for her, sort of Cape Town becomes this like space. So right now I'm reading it as a kind of like, in a weird way, I don't know, sort of there's a kind of domesticity and sort of hinterland sort of gender thing that I think is happening that I still need to think about, right? Because she is, from the sort of quotes that I gave, sort of forging sort of diasporic sort of feminist sort of networks within Cape Town, right? But it's not clear what happens, as she sort of moves out of that. I mean, the chapter is rather short, so yeah. And yeah, it's something I'm sort of reading like through genre. In the later parts of the chapter, when sort of thinking about how people like Clemens Katali who moved from Malawi to South Africa, but via Zimbabwe, right? And as they're moving south, they're sort of encountering all these sort of forms of racial oppression, right? There's a completely different sense of coevality there, right? Where, as the son of a chief, they're also going through similar sort of kinds of like experiences. So in some ways, this sort of interior hinterland thing sort of falls apart. But I'm also just interested in the port city. You find it in like Biohorse's work, Roots of Remembrance, where sort of like the relationship between Accra and sort of like inland parts of Ghana, the Gold Coast, sort of stages these things around, so who gets to be modern and who gets to not be modern. So sort of the port city as in itself is some sort of space that structures the relationship between certain forms of circulation and globalization and the forms of global blackness that can be read through, particularly the port city, is one of the things that I'm also trying to get at. Yeah.
Not sure if this is a bit off, but I was thinking of the other forms of migration that aren't really registering among these, should I call them elite mobile forms, that is represented by, and since you're focusing on the Anglophone for the most part, there seems to be a disjuncture between that type of mobility that's happening that you are focused on and the mobility that's actually taking place among different people experiencing a different kind of modernity, if you will, as in peasants and rural populations and surplus urban populations during that moment, which seems to me to be a staging ground for what happens in the post-colonial period, the disjuncture between those who were able to move and the intellectual strategies and projects and programs between they and the large numbers of people. I wouldn't call them masses, but the large numbers of people who are themselves seeking to escape, displaced, colonially displaced, and seeking perhaps to generate a new sense of self, refashioning themselves in places that are now being hegemonized, if you will, by the United States. So there's that's also happening during that time that I think I'm concerned about in the whole exposition. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the artifact that I'm reading and the kinds of arguments, and you sort of see it also in how, I guess, even Corbyn is sort of mediating this person who's speaking, right? That allows him to do certain things discursively, and as you say, the form of, it's a very sort of elite sort of sensibility and thing. And it seems to me that what someone like Alice Kinloch is opening up a space, right? The way she's making an argument within the Pan-African Conference about how capital is organizing, reorganizing space and reorganizing mobility. It seems that she's talking about people that are being disenfranchised but forced into sort of the labor, the labor system itself, right? The mining compounds, etc. And I think some of these things may be sort of in the sort of later parts when thinking about the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, where sort of Garvey really becomes a really important sort of figure in sort of thinking about questions of, nationhood and resistance. I think those things sort of become sort of, come into play, but then the question still remains, if one sort of historicizes as a kind of post-First World War thing, what's happening in these other decades and the material that I'm looking at, right? And perhaps the thing for me to think about is then how are the different ways in which capital is organizing Black labor and mobility represented even in the elite newspapers, right? Even if one is making an argument or one is aware that there's a kind of elite sensibility, right? So Peregrino, he's a labor broker, right? Is that something that is ambiguous and also problematic within the kinds of networks that he's forming? And how does he understand? How does he understand capital in relation to imperial belonging, right? Because it seems that the kind of inherent sort of hierarchies that are structured by capital might not necessarily be sort of disentangled or challenged or unpacked in the very sort of forms of labor that he's performing outside of his work as a newspaper person, right? So, it's something to kind of keep in mind for me. Some of the scholarship, I didn't cite it explicitly. They refer to him as a duplicitous figure, right? Precisely because it seems he's sort of facilitating basically the entrenchment of a kind of sort of like labor oppression on the one hand, but also he's also this figure who seems to be like fostering a Pan-African community. So then how is class itself being built into this very imagination as these people who have a particular history of migration are encountering people who are being organized by capital in other ways? It's a tension. I don't know if I've...
Thank you. Khwezi, we are past time. Friends, we are past time. You are always welcome to continue the conversation in a more casual setting outside this room and continue chatting. But Khwezi, I want to thank you a great deal for this really wonderfully dense and interesting presentation from which I have learned a lot, and I'm sure others have too. So thank you very much.